It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I'm so glad we have this time together. I'm Sana Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. After her best friend's mysterious death, Elizabeth Smith's picture perfect life in the Memphis suburbs has spiraled out of control. So much so that she hires a personal assistant to keep her on track. Composed and elegant, Brianna slides so neatly into Elizabeth's life and proves herself indispensable. Soon, the assistant Elizabeth hired to distract her from her obsession with her friend's death is the same person working with her to uncover the truth behind it. Because Brianna has questions too. She wants to know why the police killed her young black son, why someone in Elizabeth's neighborhood called the cops on him that day, who took that first step that stole her child away from her. And the only way she's ever going to be able to find out is to entwine herself deep into Elizabeth's life, where the answers to her questions lie. As the two women hurtle towards an electrifying final showdown and the lines between employer and friend blur, it becomes clear that neither of them is what they first appear. That is the book jacket description to While We Were Burning by Sara Koffi. And today we have Sara with us on Let's Grab Coffee. Sara is a writer and editor from Memphis, Tennessee, with a BA in English from Whittier College. As a writer, she strives to explore the nuances of unlikable female characters and humanize Black women by giving them space on the page to breathe. While We Were Burning is her debut novel, and what a debut it is. Sara, thanks so much for joining us today. So glad to have you here.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here and have a chat.
Yes, when I saw that this book was set in Memphis, that immediately grabbed me. I mean, I think for a lot of folks who love to read, there's not so often that we see a book that's set in our hometown,
Yeah.
unless it is, a historical piece, right? Of course, but just a fiction book that's not that common. And so immediately I was like, okay, I have to know more. And of course, you're also a Memphian because who else could write with such insight into our city? And so I'm just so excited to have you here and to have this conversation about you and your work.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like the last book that I can think of that was set in Memphis was probably The Firm. Uh, when I think of like thriller set in Memphis. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my goodness. And then even if you think about some of the shows that have Memphis as a backdrop, I don't think they really truly capture Memphis from a Memphian's perspective, right? Because it is usually outsiders writing some sort of treatment, and there's all these different assumptions about Memphis. I mean, I still have people who say, like, do y'all have running water? I mean, the way people imagine the South is just
Gotta say, one of my biggest pet peeves is on TV and movies where they're supposed to be in Memphis, but you can tell they're filming in Atlanta because of the trees, right? And I'm like,
yes.
okay, so you're using Atlanta for Memphis. And I think it only like annoys Memphians, but I'm like, it drives me crazy whenever I see it.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because I'm right. Like, as you said that, I was picturing different movies where exactly the same thing. I'm always looking when it's set in Memphis. I'm like, I want to know how Memphis is this. And it is the tree that I'm like, okay, you weren't here, but okay,
Yeah.
I guess I'll let it slide. But listeners, while we were burning, we don't have to let anything slide because we have a real Memphian writing a very Memphis setting. And it was so fun for me to kind of think about like the character of these different places and spaces. And so I'm wondering too, for you, well, one, how did you kind of decide what parts of town or even what landmarks that you wanted to include? And then also, what has been the reception from Memphis versus kind of like non-Memphis readers?
That's a good question. So I will say, I will take it back to when I first like conceived of it really. Like just the setting itself. So, at first I was thinking I'm writing a thriller. I want a fast-paced domestic thriller. I was thinking, oh, the usual cities, right? New York, LA, Chicago, because that's where like a lot of the big thrillers are set. But I was like, I'm not from those places, right? So why am I writing a book about these places?
Hmm.
I was like, why not set a thriller in Memphis? Like we could have a thriller. No reason we can't.
Yeah.
And then, funny enough, when I started doing that, I then started like making like streets up, like making up restaurants. And then like on my second draft, I was like, why don't I just put like real places I know? So it was very
Yes.
much like, and then that made things a lot easier for me because I was like, I can like conceptualize, real places, right? Like actual parts of the city and all that. So it's very helpful. And I think doing that, when it comes to Memphians, there's obvious connection. Like I get like DMs from Memphis who read it, they're like, "Oh, I love this! Like, it's so set in the city. Like, it's so cool seeing like just the city in book form." I have people ask me like, like, "What's your favorite like wing spot?" Because like they can tell like it's like it's like oh, and actually Memphian wrote this, so she probably has an opinion on things like this in the city. So I think that was like, I don't know, it's very exciting and very fun to have that connection like with the readers too.
Absolutely. And I love that I saw on Instagram, you had like a map of key
Yeah.
places that you mentioned in the book. And it just made it so, as a Memphian, it just kind of enriched my experience of the book. But then I could imagine for folks not familiar with the city, it also kind of gave them just visually an idea of like where the characters in your book were kind of traveling or where different things were happening.
Yeah, the map thing was great, but it was also very funny because one of the notes I got back early on from an editor was something like, you write about the city like everyone already knows like everything about it, right? They're like, you're talking about like Midtown, like what does that mean to a reader, right? It's like how far away is that from where your main character lives? You have to explain that. So,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I could imagine that's also a balance of like you already have all this stock knowledge, right? And
yeah.
but again, readers don't necessarily know what these different places or spaces mean, the meaning that they hold, or
Yeah.
the feelings or perceptions they hold for people from Memphis. And that really became clear to me. I'll just say one piece when you talk about Lakeside and you write in the book like Lakeside Mental Health Facility. And I'm like, yeah, but to Memphian, like you wouldn't have to say that. You could just say
No.
Lakeside.
Yeah.
So yes, I do acknowledge that you have to bring your reader in, and that sometimes that can be like balancing again, like what you already know versus what you want to make sure that your reader knows, so they're experiencing this in the same way that you want them to.
Exactly. Yeah, also funny enough, that was something. The lakeside thing is actually one of the notes where it was just like, what is lakeside to someone who's not from the city? And the note was something like, I looked it up, so I know what it is. Like, a reader will not look it up. You have to tell them what it is.
Oh my goodness. And that's so funny because I read that and then I was like, if I didn't know, if you had just said Lakeside, like would I have been able to kind of use context clues to
No,
figure out, what was happening here or what it was meant to refer to? And so that's so funny because that was the one that really popped out. I was like, nobody from Memphis would say like this
no.
full name. They would just shorthand it and say Lakeside, and we'd all be on the same page. But speaking of getting your reader onto the same page as you, I'm wondering how you decided, or what were some of the specific maybe details that you wanted to include, whether it's about space, place, or even the characters, to make sure that your readers were going on this same journey that you wanted to take them on through this story.
Ooh. Do you mean just in terms of like the city or just in terms of writing? Because
Both.
that's
Yeah.
okay. Okay, I was like, that's a good question. Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, that's a good question too. So I wanted to make sure it came across, because the whole thing like is about class and race as well, right?
Mhm.
So like where the characters like lived made sense with their background, would also kind of signify to Memphians, right?
Mhm.
Immediately class. Like, Elizabeth living in Harbor Town means what? Like, she has at least $500,000. Something's going on, right? Like, like
Right.
she has some money to buy a house in Harbor Town, Brianna being from like essentially like Whitehaven area, like tells you her background, which is like, more of a working class neighborhood as well. So just
Mhm.
keeping those things in mind while writing, that was important to me too, because it also gives you a sense of the city. Because I went in wanting to show that, there is this divide in Memphis, like with
Mhm.
class and race, like despite being, a Black majority city,
Mhm.
we still have places that feel like they are like white only, like
Yeah.
sincerely places where it's just like you go and like, oh, everyone here is like white, which doesn't
Mhm.
make any sense for the city's makeup.
Yeah.
But it does make sense when you get into the class of it all, right? And where you would
Mhm.
expect to find more diverse crowds versus where you wouldn't, especially when you get out to like, I'll say like Collierville area now, Lakeland area. Like the further you get, like the less less diverse it's getting as you go
Mhm.
along. So that was important to me to get that sense of that dichotomy there in the story too.
Yeah, and it really comes through. As a reader, I was kind of going back and forth between like loving to be enveloped in this story that was to me a Memphis story, right? Like setting in Memphis and even the themes, I think very, Memphis themes as well. But then also thinking about like how would I read this as someone not from the city, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought that was really great to have a setting in Memphis that was really reflective and I think authentic to what Memphis is, again, versus how some people have this idea of like we don't have running water or like
Yeah.
whatever is happening. And so I just really appreciated for me kind of feeling seen through this story as a Memphian, and that gave me a lot of like great pride in this book.
Yeah, I was gonna add something that is just kind of like a funny anecdote because the city's rapidly changing, right?
Oh yeah.
So in the character, in the book you have like Elizabeth who is very much anti-Cordova because she sees it as like, just the suburbs, right? And like
Yeah.
not very interesting to her. But it's so funny because I was talking to someone recently and they're just like, Cordova is diversifying pretty rapidly. So now when people read the book, they might think she's just like a racist about that. Like, why is she avoiding Cordova so much? And I was like, that's so funny. I was like, I did not think about that. Like, yeah, with time passing, it will just seem like she wants to avoid like black people.
That's a good point too about yeah, the book is written from a certain, time and place with you as the writer, right?
Yeah.
Bringing your ideas and your understanding of the place as it currently is into the
Yes.
book. But the book was also very much written as a reflection of a certain time and space. I know you've talked a lot about kind of what led you to write this book. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more with our listeners about kind of the motivations, or at least the backdrop of, your headspace as you were writing while we were burning.
Yeah, so I got the seeds for this book during the summer of 2020. You had the George Floyd murder, you also had the Breonna Taylor murder. And at the time, I was just kind of worried. Like, a lot of people were worried, like we weren't going to see justice done in any meaningful way in these
Mm-hmm.
cases. And then that kind of got me thinking about like, what would justice look like if someone else decided to, take it into their own hands, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go from there to like trying to find which genre is the best for that. And for me, I was like, well, thrillers, right? Because people tend to be okay going along with that kind of journey on a thriller. Other genres, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but people come into thrillers not expecting perfect characters, which is very important, like for
Yes.
a book like this. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would say my headspace was just, clouded with just concern, but also a lot of rage too, which I've mentioned before. Like I was just
Mm-hmm.
very angry and just wanted to kind of process these feelings. And I also like, and I'm glad I wrote it because it felt like when once it was out there, I realized that that feeling connected other people, like it resonated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that actually like helped me process it more. Just like I was not so alone in my head about like all these awful things and thinking all this stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
it was very cathartic for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the mark of really great writing, right? It's tapping into some shared feelings and some shared, rage or grief or
Yeah.
love or confusion, and to find a place even in, a fictional book about saying like, wow, I can kind of play out kind of my feelings or my
Yeah.
perspectives on things that are happening. And I love this idea of having these very unpredictable, unlikable characters. Because in the book, emotionally, I'm like, you find places where you relate or you don't relate or where you're rooting for or rooting against these different characters. And I absolutely love being like wrapped up in the story of who these people are. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about being able to write these characters who are unlikable or who don't have to fit the quote unquote mold of what we think of a woman character or even in a specific genre.
Yeah. I was gonna say it's funny, like to me, very amusing when people are kind of like, live reacting to the book and I catch on to it where they're like, oh, I like Elizabeth and now I don't like her. I like Brianna, now I don't like her. Wait, I like Brianna again. It's like, it's very like I've also seen reviews where someone is just like, I hate both of these people, 5 stars. Like I hate like
Oh, that's
yeah.
good feedback. That's a good compliment.
That's great. Yeah, but it's kind of like just like my mission, my passion to introduce more unlikable female characters just into like fiction because I feel like there's an an expectation there, like with a female character that, they're supposed to be, likable or like, relatable, or just like you're supposed to understand their motivations and be rooting for them. And I'm like, that's not super interesting to me. It's also just very, very limiting from a fiction standpoint. Just like it's limiting in real life as well.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that expectation that women are like, I don't know, supposed to be good and care, right? Like everything. And so I'm like, we can at least try to fix that expectation on the page in fiction and like hope it reflects in real life too, over time. But that's just very important to me to like have women be like complicated layer characters that are still interesting and you want to follow, because there are so many, like male characters in fiction where it's just like they're awful, but like, they're beloved, right?
Hmm.
Like, and so I'm trying to introduce that more female characters too.
Yeah, I absolutely love both of the primary characters in the book, Elizabeth and Brianna. I loved how layered they are and how it's not a clear cut you like them or you hate them, right? And I
Yeah.
think as you mentioned, that's true to life. Like people are very complex, messy people, and there's not just this whole, right or wrong, good or evil,
Right.
but rather there's multiple layers. And I have to say, in reading your book, I love that it kept me guessing. Like every chapter, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is going to happen. And I'm like, this is going to happen. And then none of those things happen,
Yeah.
which I love because I think, as readers or even just folks who, listen to stories, which is all of us, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
movies or books or whatever, we do come to anticipate kind of, okay, this is how this story goes. This is, the archetype or whatever. And you've written these characters and this plot that truly is a page turner. I read this
Yeah.
book in one setting that was not my intention. But I was like, no, we have to stay up the rest of this night and finish this because I wanted to know like how it was going to end.
Yeah, literally what happens. That's one of my favorite like feedback I get where people are just like, I was on chapter 3 and like I had to like try to call a friend who'd read it and like, have them tell me what happened because they were like, like or at least give me a hint because I don't know what's happening. I had like it was funny, like I saw one lady reviewer, she was just like, oh, I thought it was very predictable, but then I kept going and it was like, oh wait, this is not what I thought this book was going to be. Like, so
Yes.
I do enjoy that. And it's from a storytelling standpoint too. I think it's important to when telling thrillers, like, kind of stuff too. It's okay to be predictable in some aspects, right? Because you want people to be like, yeah, I understand what's happening in the story. But my goal is to have like that last, like, like just really surprising twist you didn't see coming. So if you guess like, the first two, the last one's like, whoa, I really had no idea.
Yes. Yeah. Enough so that we're like, it's not too many new, different, disorienting
Yeah.
components. But of course, having all of those twists and turns, the hallmark of a thriller. I mean, as a reader, of course, I was surprised because I didn't write the book. But, for you as a writer, were there also moments that surprised you?
Yes, one of my favorite moments, but I cannot discuss without getting into spoilers,
Right.
was a total surprise because I had like, I'm what you call like a pantser, like half pantser, half like plotter when it comes to when I'm writing books, basically. So I had like a kind of outline for each chapter as I was going along, and then one thing happened that was very surprising to me, but I was like, this feels right for the character. I'll put it that
Hmm.
way. So that was a very fun, surprising moment for me as a writer.
I love those moments where, as a writer, you get to be surprised by where
Yeah.
your own thoughts take you or where the characters take you, because eventually they do kind of have their own life that you want to
Yeah.
honor in the book as well. And so I love that you are also able to be, surprised in the process. Speaking about process, there are a few different things that you mentioned in the book. I don't want to say, too much, but I'll just say one, for example, like Brianna is in school in the book for nursing or pharmacy. And I'm wondering how much additional research you had to do for maybe different pieces like that you added in the book.
Oh, yeah. So I'm not the greatest researcher. And by that I just mean like I get very frustrated very easily when I'm looking things up. So I prefer to make things up, right? But that's
Mhm.
one you really can't make up. So I literally had to do some research. Like I was looking at like the NCLEX questions.
Okay. Mhm.
Like yeah, and like seeing like which ones are like relevant and like would you ask a question like this and how would this be like, and basically what it's such a weird question, but it was like, what hints could someone maybe give you that they know a lot about like medicine and pharmacy that aren't like something you pick up on immediately, right?
Mhm.
Because I want readers kind of get like, oh yeah, she's into nursing, but she also knows a lot about like medication, right? She knows
Right.
like
Yeah.
without spoiling anything.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to hint that Brianna knows a lot in this department. So, but that it's that thing where like I'm writing a character that's smarter than me, so it's frustrating because like I am not as smart as Brianna, so if he has to sound smart, so I have to like do this research. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there are other moments in the book where similarly, I was like, oh wow, like I wonder if, if Sarah knows, like if she was ever interested in pharmacy, for example, or if
Yeah.
she, whatever, and how much research. That's always interesting to me in crafting, like how you crafted this story and the decision making on, okay, what kind of backstory or how much do I need to research this, kind of to your point, so that even the reader, if they had some background, they would know, like, oh, and they would
Yeah.
be able to pick up on some of these things. I did not research the pharmacy questions that you included in there, but I just assumed that they were like really legit.
Yeah. Yeah, those are questions you might find on the NCLEX. So it's just like, okay, that seems legit enough. We're good. Uh,
Yes. Well, I mean, it definitely set the scene for me. I want to go back a little bit to something you mentioned about thrillers and kind of the way that thrillers or that genre gives you permission to kind of do a little bit more or something a little bit different with, in this case, these female characters. Um, for our listeners, one, could you kind of set the landscape of thrillers as a genre? Um, because I'm also wondering how common or rare is it for there to be thrillers written by women and particularly written by Black women with Black women leading characters.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, ooh, okay. So I would say there are a lot of thrillers written by women. You know, it's a very like women-friendly genre, I'd say. But the issues is when you have a book led by a Black woman. But I'll be honest, any woman of color leading a thriller is gonna be an issue immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Because unfortunately you find the pushback is like, oh, well, if she's of color, then her problems are, not going to be relatable as much to like white readers, even though I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't, that's just not the case, right? Like just read the book. That's basically how
Right.
I feel about that. But I will say, yeah, overall the genre is very women friendly, but if you want to bring up race of any sort, even if your book is not about race, but the main character is woman of color, you have that issue come up of pushback. And then God forbid you make everyone in the book of color. That's even worse. That's
Right.
just like, oh, we're not going to read that. That's just not going to be a thing. So,
Mm-hmm. It's so funny you mentioned that because, it wasn't until well into my adulthood that I maybe was seeking out or even able to read books that had women of color as leads or that were completely all folks of color in a book. And I had to say, like, how transformative that was for me, where I was like, yes, this is what I was looking for, like that extra kind of connection that is so subtle. But it's just coming out in the perspective, right? It's not that a white author is trying to assume and input, certain kind of characteristics or scenarios, but instead you can tell that subtle difference in that point of view that's just in the book naturally.
yeah.
And so I really appreciated While We Were Burning, um, because it wasn't like someone was forcing or trying to, conjure up these different scenarios or personalities, but they seemed, very natural and not forced.
Yeah.
And I think what part of what surprised me too in the book was the way you were able to craft these two women, very different personalities, very different points of view. And it really comes out in that the difference in point of view, how the different chapters and different characters are written from whose point of view. And I'm wondering, um, did you always know you're going to have kind of like this first person, third person kind of narration, or how did you come to decide kind of how the book would actually be written?
Yeah. So I wouldn't know we were going to have like two POVs. And I'm trying to figure out how to say it without spoiling it. But okay, I have a way. Okay.
Okay.
That's okay. It is okay. There is a way. But basically, I went to first person for Elizabeth specifically. Because I was like, of course it's first person because she thinks like the world revolves around her, right? So like
Hmm.
it's always like, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? It's always about me. And then Brianna is like close third person, because this is someone who was like empathetic, right? Who like
Mm.
thinks about the world and like what her friends are feeling. And like I was like, I wanted to show that just like even as how they're talking on the page, like what person they're talking in. And then in terms of just writing it, funny, like going into it, I was just like, Elizabeth's POV is always just like, just the worst things you can say, but like with a smile. Like she is very like she is a hater at every opportunity, basically, in the book. Like I was like, her personality is just like every situation is like everyone sucks. Like I'm the only one here who's awesome, right? Always, every time. And then writing Brianna was like, okay, so the opposite of what Elizabeth would think and feel, right? About a lot of
Yeah.
situations. Coming into it, being less like emotionally selfish, like yeah, I put it that way. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love those different points of view and how full they made those characters feel. And I also really love that Elizabeth, like you didn't let her off the hook, right? Like
No.
in developing who she was and kind of her personality and all the other details that we learn about her throughout the book, you never let her off the hook. And so I loved everything about both of these characters so much. Of course, at the heart of this book are two very traumatic experiences, two big losses. And even though those kind of, are the main storyline, I also found the book a lot about the ideas of love.
Yeah.
Which of course love and loss go together,
Mm.
but love of friends, love of family, and even that romantic love as well, even though I know this
Yeah.
isn't a romance book. I really found that interesting. And I know for you, you've mentioned in other interviews that you started out wanting to write,
Yeah.
romance or thinking that might be, your genre. And so it was interesting for me to kind of think back in all the places in the book where I'm like, this is very much a story about romance as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Romance was basically like my first love for a genre. But I mentioned before, it wasn't gonna work because I write unlikable female characters. That's part of the problem. Because when I was, writing these romances, the notes I always got back was like, your lead character, is she so snarky, or she always goes back and forth with the male lead. And I was like, well, I don't mind a snarky woman. I think that works, especially,
Hmm.
it's just her personality. Like, if he's being snarky, she's being snarky back. I think it works. There's a balance there. But I kept getting that note, and I was just like, okay, I have to switch genres. Like it's not working. Like they're not gonna let me do this in romance. So I'm like, I'm gonna try a different genre. But of course, I still have like, romance on the brain. So like I do incorporate, those elements too. I'm also just interested in exploring like love in general, like, yeah, friend love and friendship, romantic love, but also the way love can be twisted, right, into something very harmful and very easily become a weapon, whether you want it to or not. So that's very interesting to me too.
Yeah, and that very much comes out in the book as well. The many ways that love is being used or abused. And when I think about this masterful story that you've written in While We Were Burning, that idea of love, because there's lots of different types of love happening in this book. And I'll be honest, and I don't want to give anything away, but some of the different ways that people are reflecting on love made me think about, how do I think about love in my own life? So, I thought that was really unexpected for me as a reader. I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm gonna, walk away thinking about love
Yeah.
and the way that I receive it or want it or the expectations that I have for it. But that did come out for me. That was one of the takeaways in reading While We Were Burning.
Yeah, I'm very happy you said that. That was like one of my, like ulterior motives for a writer, right? The goal is to get people thinking about that, especially that concept. And again, I can't go into spoilers or anything, but the ending is especially wants you to think about what love actually means to these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of those other maybe more minor themes, I don't know, you can tell me if it was minor to you, was this idea of church or maybe even this idea of religion, depending on how we want to think about it. And I'm wondering to what extent, did you want the book to be a commentary on the role of church or the role of faith in our lives?
Yeah. So when I thought of the role of church within the book, for mostly for Brianna's, like only for Brianna's, I think POV actually only
Right.
for
Yeah.
Brianna. Because I was thinking like, where would a Black Southern woman be like, kind of dealing with the emotional aspects? Because I think, yeah, it's not a spoiler. I can say this. But basically, see in the book, Elizabeth like goes to therapy, right? And then
Mhm.
Brianna never does. She only ever goes to church and like talks to her friends and stuff about like what's going on with her emotionally. So I kind of wanted that contrast, like, it's also a class thing, right? It's like, if you can't
Mhm.
afford therapy, where are you going to go? Who you're going to talk to? So she's going to be talking to her pastor and working her emotions out there. And I will say there wasn't really an overarching theme with religion in the book. It was more about just showing like, where is the support group going to be, based on class, like
Mhm.
who are they going to talk to about their emotional struggles. But I did want it to be to show that Brianna had some connection to the church to kind of emphasize the disconnect, right? Like
Mhm.
after she experienced like, her tragedy, and kind of like what happened from there, I'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say for me, when I was reading some of the conversations that she had in the context of church or her relationship with her pastor, I was very interested in the response from the church, right,
Yeah.
to this type of situation, to even just pastoral care. And so that for me also came through. Certainly, church is not a big theme in the book, but in the places that relationship did show up, I was like, oh wow, like
Yeah.
oh, I wonder like how a church, fictional or not, would
Yeah.
even approach this.
Yeah.
Yes, I really love that. For you, was church, since we're talking about church, was church or is church a big part of your life? Thinking again about the different personal experiences that made it into the book, was that really central to you?
Yeah. So growing up 100%. So you're the first person to ever ask this question. I've not had to go into it before, but yeah. So my grandfather was actually a pastor of a
Mm,
church in Memphis. So I was like there every Sunday growing up, whether I wanted to be or not. It didn't matter. You're going
yes.
to church. Um,
Absolutely.
and I would say church is also a big part of my life. Whenever I go back home for anything, I will be in church. I will be again.
Absolutely.
I do not have a choice. Um, so I'll put it that way, where like there is an emotional connection there, especially the one my grandfather was the pastor of.
Mhm.
So yeah, I just for me, feeling comfort there as well is important, but it's also comfort, not so much the religious aspect, just like people and
Yeah.
people who care about you. Because I will say, for my book launch in April, people who were part of my grandfather's church showed up for my book launch, and that
Oh,
was really sweet. They didn't tell me they were
yay.
coming. So it's like, that's really sweet. This kind of like surprised me as like they're like, well, of course we came.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, just like having that connection is nice.
And I mean, again, as a Memphian, where churches are on like every corner,
Yes.
and where it is part of just the social fabric of, of our world, I think that's very much a Bible Belt thing,
Yeah.
in particular. And so, whether you believe or don't believe, you will be at church. That's where you
I was, I was
will.
gonna say, it's like your feelings are kind of irrelevant. It's more like,
Yes, like you're gonna
like,
be
yeah.
there.
Yeah, if you want to go to like after church, like lunch or dinner, you need to actually go to church first. You can't go. You can't just show up.
Yes, but I was just thinking about that in terms of like what makes a really a Memphis experience, especially like growing up here. And it is
Yeah.
that shared language of the church. Again, even if whether you profess to believe or not, like there is that shared language, that shared experience, that you can draw upon when connecting to other with one another, or even like in a book like this, right? That
Yeah.
was another like Memphis connection to me. Like, of course you would be in church, because where else,
Exactly.
where else would you be?
Exactly.
The other fun thing, since we're talking about these Memphis connections, again, it's not a spoiler, but the other fun thing that I really loved reading about in your book is you make a passing mention to Tom Lee,
Yeah.
in Tom Lee Park. And I just love seeing that in the book. And, I know you've talked about this book kind of being like a love letter to
Mhm.
Memphis. And I was like, oh, wow, what a great, detail to include. Particularly because I think for a lot of Memphians who are just now in the past year or so, really understanding who Tom Lee was, and
Mhm.
that Tom Lee wasn't a white guy. Like,
Yep.
that's a revelation for Memphians who've lived here our whole lives, right?
Yeah, I think I put that in there because it stuck with me because when I was little, my grandma took me, to Tom Lee Park, and we were just, she liked to sit and like just watch the water and stuff.
Yeah.
And the first time I saw, like, I think it may have changed now, but back then when it said like, a very worthy Negro, and I was like, Grandma, what is that about?
Yeah. I got questions.
Yeah. And she actually, she explained it to me, and I was just fascinated by that. I was like, that is so, I'm like, I'm like, just the implications like
Yeah.
putting it up there, even basically implying, right, that like he stands out not because he's a hero, but because he's like a hero of, a hero who's a black man, right? And I'm like, that is so like, it's like a racist trying to give you a compliment, right? It
Yeah,
was such a weird
very much.
like, it was such a weird thing. I was like, why are they mentioning that he's, black on this plaque? So strange. But yeah, that was something that has been with me since childhood. I'm like, people need to know that's such a weird thing in Memphis. Like,
Absolutely. Yes. One of my previous guests is Dominic Lawson, who's the creator of Black is America podcast. And so he has an episode that is all about Tom Lee and his heroic efforts and
yeah,
why Tom Lee, was commemorated in this way. And I'll be honest, like I never really kind of thought twice about like, oh, Tom Lee Park, like who is Tom Lee?
yeah,
Why is this park, named after this person? And, with most things named after, old dead white men, I just kind
yeah,
of assumed, right? Like, oh, just another like dead white guy who
yeah.
did something that maybe was of note or honestly maybe wasn't. Like, who's to say? Um, and so it was just really exciting for me to see you include that little nugget, in the book. So there's, it's a lot of fiction, but there's a lot of fact in the book as
Yeah.
well.
I was gonna say, usually in the South, if it's, a dead white man, he was just a Confederate general of some sort. So that's why he's being commemorated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sure. I'm wondering, thinking about the storyline of the book and even the characters, did you feel pressure to represent either of the characters or even the situations, like in a certain way? Did you feel any pressure that there was an expectation that they should be presented in a certain way? Did you feel it was risky to maybe tell, even though it is a fiction story, to tell it in a certain way?
Yeah, I will say there's always I'll say some risks, particularly with representing, Black women in
Hmm.
fiction, right? Because my biggest, even though it didn't stop me from doing it, my biggest concern was getting like negative feedback about Brianna, because Brianna is not a perfect character. Right? She is a hero to some, I'll put it that way, but not to like a lot of people. Like it depends on how you read the book, right?
Hmm.
So I was more concerned about her because I'm like, she's technically not good representation, like as a person, but she is in terms of like fiction, right? Like I think
Yeah.
it's good to have that layered character. But I think Brianna was the only one I was worried about and how she'd be like perceived as a Black woman, not being on her best behavior in fiction.
Mm.
And so,
Yeah. Um, what has been the response for folks who have read the book and, followed Brianna's kind of narrative? What has been the response in who she is as a character in this story?
yeah, so I'll say like I typically don't read reviews. I have like
Good.
people either will send me reviews, which is nice, if it's like a good rating. So so I can't tell you what is on Goodreads right now.
Mhm.
But from what I've seen, it's really interesting too because it comes down to how people read the book.
Mhm.
Because I had like early on, like beta readers and stuff too, right? So early on, I had a white reader say like, oh, like the ending was so like just sad. Like, I was just kind of like, great book, but I was sad by the end of it. And then I had a
Yeah.
black reader who was like, oh, I was like cheering. I was so happy by the end of the book. So I'm like, I was like, it's seeing that divide. It's just like fascinating to me. It's like, yeah, it's like, like who are you connecting with and like how are you reading the book? Like, and how does the ending
Mhm.
land for you? But when I found out it was not a universal, like sad or happy ending, I was like, that's really interesting. It's like all comes down to who you're talking to.
Yeah.
So
I
and then
love, oh, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. I was gonna say, I think my most unexpected question I got from a reader, but I thought it was just like, again, a different way to read the book, was her. Can I say it without spoiling it? Yeah, I think I can. I think I can actually. Because basically, her question was like, basically, is Brianna gonna be okay in the future? Like based on the ending,
Mhm.
like, is she going to be okay, emotionally, and does like her life turn out happy? And I was like, that is such like like no one ever asked me that before,
Mm-hmm.
basically. So I was shocked by that question. I was like, it's interesting to care about, the future of the characters in that way. And I hadn't thought about it right until that moment. So
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I can kind of give you an answer as the author, but I was like, yeah, just seeing how people kind of read the book is just really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, we all bring, our own prior knowledge or feelings or, assumptions into whatever, piece of literature or other piece of media that we're encountering. And so absolutely, depending upon, kind of who
Yeah.
you are and where you are, you're gonna read the book and feel or think different things. And I always like to say like the mark of good writing is that it makes you feel something, right?
Yeah.
And so you might be feeling outrage or sadness, but at different points, right? Depending upon who you are. I love that question, right? About like what happens to Brianna
Yeah.
after this, the idea that these characters do live on in our imaginations. And as I was reading the book, I had so many questions about other kind of little characters in the book and like what happened to them or why
Yeah.
were they like that or what is the story behind, this other thing that happened. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to know more about like all these different
Yeah.
characters and who they are and what their backstory is and what their future might hold. So I think you did just such a great job of introducing like these really juicy nuggets,
Yeah.
some of which never come back around in this book.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, it's fine. Yeah, I have been asked about the juicy nuggets too, where people are just like, can you expand on that? Like as the author, like I know it's not in the book, but what do you know? Right? It's so funny.
what do you know?
Yeah, like, what's in your outline notes? So explain what happened to this. Without spoiling, I can say a question I get is about Elizabeth's college background and her best friend in college,
Yes.
and people are just like, what happened with that?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Because that was one of the points where I was like, oh my goodness. So this is what really happened. And then I was like, oh, you were wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. So, okay, I know. I'm glad to know I'm not alone in that
Yeah.
as well. Um, I know you often keep a lot of kind of like drafts or kind of like here's some pieces that didn't make it into the book, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if any of those pieces might make it into another book, or there'll be more stories that maybe spin off of this one.
Yeah, I have enough like leftover information because it's so funny. Because one of my drafts is basically just, we were getting closer to the end of product of the book, was just taking out just a lot of side information
Hmm.
because I was like, I don't think the reader needs to know this. So it's like on like I have a draft that, like just like this is stuff taken out of the book. It's all
Yeah.
the document is. It's so funny. It's all there. But yeah. So I have a lot of background information about characters and stuff too. Um, I think if there are any ideas I want to explore still, I will just borrow, from that
Hmm.
draft document because no one's seen it but me.
Yeah.
For the most part, I feel like a lot of my ideas for this are so specific to While We Were Burning. I don't think I'd be able to repurpose them.
Hmm.
Just because like with each book, I'm usually trying to explore like just different themes and stuff too. So I'm like, I don't know how soon I'd be interested in going back into for example, like, grief, loss, but also specifically, love and like having this kind of like questionable marriage going on and all this stuff happening. So I was like a lot of that. And also, well, I can't spoil anything, but a lot of the thriller elements are specific to the
Hmm.
story. Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed you said with each book that you write. So that keys me in to know that there are
Yeah.
more books. I know that
Yes.
you have a second book already under contract,
Yes.
which you can't say anything about,
No.
but it is a thriller.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we
Yeah.
we do know that it is a thriller. Eyes already towards book three or four or five. How far in the future are we thinking?
I have books I want to do
Okay.
for book three, four, and five, right? But it's also just a matter of pitching them and
Mhm.
having people say they like them and would like to purchase them from me as well. And it's also like I try to do some market research. I know not all writers do this, but I try to keep an eye on like what's going on or like where trends are heading and stuff too
Mhm.
before I like say I'm committing to an idea. And of course, things might be different like when the book comes out, right? But like I like to
Mhm.
know like this book hasn't already been written, for example. Like someone isn't working on this same book like right now, you know.
Right.
So
Yeah. And did you always know you would be a writer?
yeah, I always wanted to be a writer. Originally, I wanted to be a poet when I was much younger. And I was gonna say even when I wanted to shift into like doing novels or screenplays, I still really thought poetry until I was like maybe in college.
Mm.
I wanted to be a poet really badly. But then of course I was an English major, and then I started reading other poetry that was good, and I was like, I'm not the best at this. I'm gonna shift, I think, into novel writing. I was I was like, I really can't compete with the legends. So I'm gonna shift. And then I went more into first short stories, and then
Mm, mhm.
getting into long form writing with novels when I felt more comfortable doing it. So
Mm. Do you think you would ever return back to short stories, or do you feel like the long form is like really where giving you the opportunity to kind of like showcase your ideas and the stories you want to tell?
yeah, I think I do like short stories, but I think I prefer long form just because like I if I have like an idea, I tend to like really want to get really into it.
Uh-huh.
So but what's funny is that my novels will probably never be over 70,000 words,
Okay.
which in novel land is actually on the shorter side for, adult novels. While We're Burning is 70,000 words. What I'm working on now is 70,000. I was like, so I'm still kind of a short
Hmm.
writer in terms of adult novels, but because I don't think I can ever do like 100,000 words.
No?
There's nothing I have to say that will take 100,000 words. I can put it that way. Like I'm still very much like, I'm trying to tell a story, but I also want to, get to the point. That's how I feel when writing. So I can't do that. Yeah.
Okay, so no 100,000, 150,000. I feel like
No.
sometimes I pick up a book and it is very hefty.
Yes. Like and I will say, of course, there are writers who are very good at that. But like I think my frustration, because again, like I come from like short stories and poems. I'm like, I feel like sometimes it feels like you're stalling for time, right? In a book. And I'm
Mm.
like, please just tell me what happens. Why are we why are we stalling for time in this book? So this is a personal frustration. I'm venting now, but that's how I feel sometimes reading like
We
books
love a
that are
good
really
vent
long.
on this show. We love a
Yeah.
good vent and a good, like all these side stories. We love
Yeah.
it. Well, with While We Were Burning, listeners, let me tell you, you'll want the story to continue going because there's just so much here, and you will be glad that it's not, over 100,000 words, because then you would probably have to spend a couple days holed up in your
Yeah.
in your in your apartment or in your house reading it, neglecting all of your other responsibilities, which might be a good vacation for you. That's how compelling this story was. So I think you crafted just a beautiful narrative, and having all the, Memphis nods in it. Absolutely amazing. Sarah, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. I absolutely loved While We Were Burning, and I can't wait until book 2 and 3 and 4 come
Yeah.
out.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Sara Koffi. Her book is While We Were Burning. Sarah is a native Memphian, a graduate of Whitehaven High School. So, we love to have another Memphian on the show. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM, your community nonprofit radio station. Look, there was so much about this book that we, of course, could not get into because I didn't want to give any spoilers. You have to read this book. It was so good. When I tell you, seriously, I did not anticipate reading this book in one setting, but I had to know what was going to happen next and what the final conclusion was going to be. And let me tell you, it did not disappoint. While We Were Burning by Sara Koffi, her debut novel. This is just the first one, the debut novel. So I cannot wait for book 2, already under contract, and then the books that will follow after that. I didn't even know that I was a fan of the thriller genre, but now I know, and maybe you will find out that you like thrillers as well. Let me leave you with this positive note as we wrap up today. Each and every day, you get to decide. Yes, you get to decide what type of day it's going to be and how you're going to show up in the world. Over time, those daily choices create not only your life, but the world around us. So, what are you creating? Once again, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Make sure you are subscribed to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation, so you can share the show with a friend, and so you can go back and listen to some of these insightful and engaging conversations as well. I hope you have learned as much as I have and that you are excited to get a book in your hands, or an audiobook as well. There is so much for us to learn, explore, and enjoy. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and I can't wait to be back with you again next week.